My name is Bill Rooney, and I am a fellow of this wonderful Center for Law and the Human Person. And I'm very pleased to introduce the last panel of the day, which will be chaired by Professor Michael Moreland. Professor Moreland is the University Professor of Law and Religion and the Director of the McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy at Villanova. He joined the Villanova faculty in 2006 and served as Vice Dean from 2012 to 2015. Professor Moreland is a scholar of constitutional law, torts, bioethics, and religious freedom. He is frequently sought for commentary at national and international conferences, in the media, and before Congress. He's published articles in leading legal, public policy, and medical journals. Professor Moreland also has chapters on law, ethics, and religion in numerous books, including titles published by the Cambridge University Press and the Oxford University Press. I'm pleased to turn the panel over to Professor Moreland for what I'm sure will be a very informative and enlightening discussion.
Thank you very much, Bill, for serving as the meta-moderator of this panel. Now I'll serve as the moderator. And briefly introduce the other two speakers, who will go in the order I'll introduce them, and then I will finish up at the end. Matthew Levering holds the James N. Jr. and Mary D. Perry Chair of Theology at Mundelein Seminary. He's the author of over 30 books and serves as the co-editor of two quarterly journals, Nova et Vetera and the International Journal of Systematic Theology. He is the senior editor of Word on Fire's new academic quarterly, The New Ressourcement. His books include Newman on Doctrinal Corruption, very relevant here, Biblical Natural Law, and is the co-author of Natural Law, a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Trialogue. Austin Walker is Associate Director and Scholar in Residence at the Lumen Christi Institute. He directs Lumen Christi's university program, where he oversees the presentation of the church's intellectual tradition on the University of Chicago campus. He also directs Lumen Christi's Cultural Forum, where he supervises the articulation of the church's mind on questions of the day for a lay Catholic audience. In 2022, he received a PhD from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, where he wrote on John Henry Newman's political philosophy. Before moving to Lumen Christi and his graduate school, he taught in the Mississippi Delta for the Mississippi Teacher Corps, where he received the Andrew P. Mullins Jr. Award in 2009. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Levering, who went to graduate school with me. So nice to be reunited with you these many years later.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm grateful, especially to Mark and to Elizabeth for inviting me and making this possible. Now the thoughts I'm going to give are fairly random in a certain sense that I was sort of exploring Newman on these themes. I titled my little reflection here, Newman on Faith Knowledge in Light of the Threat of Arbitrariness. But I'm afraid that arbitrariness may actually apply more to my paper than to anything else here. Okay, in his recent book, The Architecture of Law, Rebuilding Law in the Classical Tradition, the legal scholar Brian McCall describes the situation in contemporary jurisprudence in rather discouraging terms. Quote, not only have human positive laws grown exponentially in their number and scope, but the dominant theory of legal positivism has exalted the place of human positive law by building an entire system of law upon it alone. Human-made law has come to be viewed as self-referential, self-justified, and essentially self-restrained. End quote. His assessment seems correct, and Newman would be dismayed by the increasing sway of legal positivism, which reflects a widespread tendency in academic life to exclude anything pertaining to God as irrational or, at best, irrational. In a Newmanian university, it would make sense that, as McCall says, quote, law has an existence and an essence independent of human understanding of it or human desires for it, end quote. Now, I should mention that Brian McCall, He dedicated this book, which came out from University of Notre Dame Press. He dedicates it to Archbishop Lefebvre. So I don't agree with him there. I should mention in case any of you know that. The idea of a university offers both an understanding of the one God and an understanding of God as the origin of law. In Discourse 11 on theology as a branch of knowledge, for example, Newman defines the monotheistic understanding of God as, among other things, the one, quote, who has no origin, who is all-sufficient for himself, who created and upholds the universe, who will judge every one of us sooner or later according to that law of right and wrong which he has written in our hearts. End quote. Newman is referring to the natural law, which, as Paul says in Romans 2, is written on our hearts. The natural law is grounded in the wisdom and goodness of God himself. God is the origin and ground of law. As Newman goes on to say in Discourse 12, titled, quote, Bearing of Theology on Other Branches of Knowledge, end quote, God is, quote, sovereign over his own will and actions, though always according to the eternal rule of right and wrong, which is himself, end quote. As the eternal rule, God is eternal law for us. In God, who contains all wisdom, one finds an eternal law for the flourishing of human creatures. This eternal law is eternal because it pertains to God's infinite wisdom. It belongs to God's wisdom. In his book, The Architecture of Law, McCall notes that, quote, a common thread running between classical and modern legal positivism is the premise that law is, in the end, a product solely of human will, of either an individual or a society, end quote. By contrast, when Newman reflects upon the intellectual life, he emphasizes that faith apprehends things revealed by God. Although the human will must be moved to embrace faith, faith is a knowing, and the content of faith consists in secure knowledge. As a young Oxford don, Newman became a Tractarian in the late 1820s because there was a movement afoot to leave Anglican doctrine and practices in the hands of Parliament, elected to do the people's will. If faith is a real knowledge, deserving of a place in university life, faith's content cannot be subject to artificial, arbitrary will. High Church Anglicans of Newman's day, this is the 1820s, accepted the Erastian model in which a king has supreme authority over the church in his dominions. But new early 19th century political arrangements meant that the nobility and rural areas now had less political clout than before, and the urban areas, often unchurched or populated largely by non-Anglicans, were gaining in political power. So no longer did one need to be an Anglican to serve in Parliament, and this produced the possibility of a non-Anglican Parliament making serious ecclesiastical and doctrinal determinations for the Anglican Church on the basis of non-Anglican popular opinion. So the young Newman teamed with his friend Hurl Froude and others to start the Tractarian movement, insisting on the authority of bishops and the authority of patristic tradition. If faith is a form of knowledge able to be understood and taught in universities, then the interpretation of faith's knowledge cannot be subject to the whims of Parliament. Comparing this concern to McCall's critique of legal positivism, one can see some connections. If legal positivism means that, as McCall says, quote, law is in the end a product solely of human will, end quote, then law is on very shaky ground, as merely might makes right. Such law would be in the hands of the powerful, who could turn it whichever way they wish. If this is all that law is, then law is simply arbitrary. Likewise, Newman felt that the Erastianism of the Anglican Church of his day left Anglican doctrine in a vulnerable position. It could, in theory, at least be turned in various directions to suit the desires of the powerful, rather than being grounded in divinely given truth or in the actual community of faith. As a Tractarian Anglican, the young Newman understood the Anglican Church as the middle ground between these two errors. On the one hand, between two errors. On the one hand, the Church of Rome had given the Pope so much power that the Pope could direct the Church any which way, with the result that doctrinal corruption had set in, according to Newman as an Anglican. On the other hand, Protestants, he thought, had given all power to individual believers with their Bibles, so that each individual felt authorized to use his or her own private judgment to determine what the true content of divine revelation is. But in the late 1830s, Newman's confidence in this Anglican via media was shaken. When in Tract 90, Newman tested whether the 39 articles could be interpreted in a strongly Catholic way, in accordance with the Anglo-Catholic view that the Church of England was one of three branches, along with Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, his views were publicly condemned, the views he articulated in Tract 90, almost unanimously by the Anglican bishops. In light of this experience, he began to doubt the practical truth of his vision of Anglicanism, and to wonder whether the Roman Catholic Church had in fact managed to preserve the content of divine revelation. This question undergirds an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, a book that remains crucial for defending Catholicism in a historically conscious university setting. Newman begins with a claim that until otherwise proven, it is reasonable to think that, quote, the Christianity of the 2nd, 4th, 7th, 12th, 16th, and intermediate centuries is in its substance the very religion which Christ and his apostles taught in the 1st century, end quote. He knows, of course, that there are many differences. Unlike in his earlier book, The Arians of the 4th Century, he does not try, in his essay on development, to obscure the extent of the differences by appealing to a hidden teaching or disciplini arcani, as though dogmas of the later Catholic Church were always known but were kept hidden and transmitted only orally from bishop to bishop. Seeking to show that Catholic doctrine and practice are not arbitrary, but rather are in accord with earliest Christianity, he argues that a reasonable case can be made that explains how these changes are not corruptions of the original divine revelation given by Christ. As I see it, Newman's intellectual project here is not too far from the one articulated by McCall in the domain of legal theory. Of course, I don't mean to exaggerate the parallel. McCall thinks there is no present-day instantiation of the earlier understanding that positive law should be grounded in God's eternal law. Newman, by contrast, concludes that the faith of the Roman Catholic Church communicates the contents of divine revelation, and so there is an unbroken tradition of faithfully handing on the gospel. In the field of legal theory, McCall posits a broken tradition, exhibiting forgetfulness of natural and eternal law. McCall looks back to an earlier tradition of legal theory. He aims, quote, to rediscover those lost threads of the tradition and weave them back into a richer, deeper, broader, and ultimately more accurate understanding of the thing we call law, end quote. For his part, Newman, as an Anglican in the process of conversion in the early 1840s, likewise sought to, quote, rediscover the lost threads of tradition. He did this very much as a project of faith-seeking understanding, in accordance with his understanding of his vocation as a university professor of theology. Returning to the patristic writings with an eye to 19th century accounts of development, he argues that while development or unfolding of faith's knowledge may be expected, since our minds come to understand with increasing depth and breadth a reality that has been manifested to us, such development within a tradition cannot include ruptures with prior definitive teaching. For Newman, it is evidence of the divinely inspired transmission of the gospel when one finds that the church has developed, rather than corrupted, the deposit of faith by deepening our apprehension of its intelligible contents. By contrast, it would be evidence not of development, but of corruption of the contents of divine revelation if, in one epoch, the church solemnly taught one thing to be true about the gospel and solemnly taught that, and then, in another epoch, solemnly taught the opposite. This would mean simply that the church was not trustworthy to hand on and develop the truth bestowed by Jesus. Such a church's supposed developments would be merely the arbitrary dictates of powerful persons with power swaying one way in one epoch and the opposite way in another epoch. Now, whenever there is a real development, Newman sees logical continuity with past solemn teaching, logic here in Newman's own understanding, including the illative sense. This is why tradition is so important. It faithfully connects believers to the divinely given deposit of faith. As Newman tells his old Anglican friend Edward Bouverie Pusey, in response to the latter's criticisms of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, quote, "I am not ashamed still to take my stand upon the Fathers, and I do not mean to budge, though I hold, as you know, a process of development in apostolic truth as time goes on. Such development does not supersede the Fathers, but explains and completes them." End quote. The Church's solemn doctrinal teachings of the patristic era accord with and are deepened by, says Newman, not reversed by, further development of doctrine regarding the same realities of faith. It follows that anyone interested in Christianity should go deep not only into Scripture, but into Scripture as interpreted in the tradition, and thus into the teachings and practices of the early Church. The university then exists in part to encourage such in-depth retrieval of the Church's dogmatic past, even if Christ gave to the apostles and bishops, not to professors, the authority needed for doctrinal development. Newman well knows that there are differences, many differences among the Fathers. There is not doctrinal uniformity. This, in fact, he notes, is what a theory of true doctrinal development would expect. As he says, the one essential question is whether the recognized, this is quotation now, whether the recognized organ of teaching, the Church herself, acting through pope or council as the oracle of heaven, and therefore not in every instance of ecclesiastical teaching. The question is whether this recognized organ of teaching has ever contradicted her own enunciations. If so, the hypothesis which I am advocating is at once shattered, end quote. Fundamental for Newman on tradition, therefore, is its mediation of divine revelation. Faith is a knowledge. Faith assents to divinely revealed truths, and the body of these truths constitute real knowledge, capable of taking a place within the university curriculum. Likewise with law, mutatis mutandis. Tradition is important in law because the natural law, tradition, bears witness to God's eternal law inscribed in us. Grounded in God, law is more than a set of arbitrary dictates, and therefore law constitutes a true and enduring body of knowledge with a legitimate place in a university. Well, granted the variations in positive law that one would expect. And of course, Newman has the same account of doctrine. There'll be plenty of variations in papal teaching. But we're talking now about solemn teaching. That's what revelation involves. Okay. Tradition is important in theology because tradition bears witness to God's truth communicated by Jesus Christ and handed on and developed over the course of history. Theological tradition has a legitimate place in a university because God, although he is infinite and in that sense incomprehensible, has chosen to be known. Faith's knowledge, then, does not depend simply on the context, changing as the times change. Although faith's knowledge changes, it changes not ultimately due to the whims of the powerful, but to the wise hand of God who, working through human beings, ensures that theological truth is possible, forming a body of knowledge accessible to university study. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I want to thank first CUA and Mark and Elizabeth for bringing me here. I really appreciate this. And thank you, Michael, as well. Now, I've been given the task of talking about philosophy in the university. I've titled my remarks, Unity and Analogy in the Philosophy of the Imperial Intellect. And it puts me in the happy position where I can first tell you why Ginny was exactly right yesterday to say that Mary is the pattern of the comprehensive mind and a philosopher after the Marian way. And I also get to tell you why Mark was exactly right to say, to draw an analogy between Christian theology and constitutional law, and why Jeff was right to unsay that there's a good analogy between Christian theology and constitutional law. I was talking to Jesus this morning trying to figure out how I was going to make my 25-minute presentation fit within 15 minutes, and then Jen Frey said everything I wanted about, and better than I could, the unitive power of philosophy within the university. So I'll take those 3 pages out. So my goal in this brief paper is to sketch some of the main lineaments of what Newman alternatively calls true philosophy, the perfection of the intellect, the philosophical habit of mind, the philosophy of the imperial intellect, and at another place, wisdom. 2 distinctive features of this philosophy of the imperial intellect are its unitive power and its analogical power. Its power to draw all things into one in a circle of the sciences, and its ability to use analogical reasoning, balance multiple analogies together. Once I've elaborated these 2 features, I want to look at a couple of examples from Newman's own writings during his university period, where we see him make use of these powers and this philosophy. My purpose here is less to lay out Newman's philosophy per se than to give an image of a mind formed by philosophy in action. But as a way into what Newman's philosophy is, I want to begin by contrasting it with what it is not. Though the discourses that make up the idea of the university were written in 1852, they were finally published as the idea of the university in 1859. And when he publishes them in 1859, he puts a preface at the beginning, and he explains why he's doing this. And he says, "One of the chief evils of the day lies in the belief that an intellectual man is one who is full of views on all subjects of philosophy, on all matters of the day. The public and literary world demands a reckless originality of thought, a sparkling plausibility of argument, and a demand for crude theory and unsound philosophy rather than none at all. It's almost thought a disgrace," Newman says, "not to have a view at a moment's notice on any question, from the personal advent to the cholera to mesmerism. Here's a delight in and a demand for novelty and eccentricity, and the literary world itself calls the producers of this content original thinkers." Newman, in surveying the spectacle, names it viewiness, which he tries to distinguish from true philosophy. Viewiness manifests itself in 2 ways. The first is to gather as many opinions or views as one can without regard for consistency. I think this is what Phaedrus does in the Phaedrus, right? He just loves speeches. He'll gather them all up. The second way is to be a man of one idea, in which every question of the day can be referred back to a single explanatory principle. We all like to make fun of the Marxist, right, for whom even the sandwich that is made wrong is a result of the class struggle. But even for me, I noticed traveling through the airport yesterday, I found myself saying, this damn secular technological liberalism screws me again. So we all do it. Since the standard of viewiness is not truth, but rhetorical adequacy to the moment, disparate or even opposite methods can serve this same end. And as much as the delight in novelty is an evil of the public culture, the more fundamental danger is that it flatters the pride of a man who takes private judgment to be the appropriate intellectual stance. All sciences and opinions must come to me to make their case, and what I can explain by my own preferred method is the standard of truth. No authority is trustworthy. We've moved only to private judgment. Now, against viewiness, this is where Newman is excellent. Newman suggests not censorship, not a better public press, not even an alternative Catholic public press, but a different institution entirely. He proposes the physical presence of a university. And this physical presence of the university should have an imaginative influence, whereby it is seen as a rival authority to the public press, and it turns men's minds away from frenetic free speech and towards a slower kind of thought that develops in a concrete location as a result of personal influence, oral tradition, and other things we could talk about. We can hear familiar echoes in Newman's earlier concerns during the Oxford movement of wanting to familiarize the imagination of the public mind to an apostolical state of the church. In both these instances, the public mind is confounded by the claims of authority and independence inherent in a true university or apostolical church. Rather than direct argumentation, you got to refamiliarize the imagination. Now, this university that will serve as a rival authority in the public mind is animated by, formed by, and serves as the proper home for what Newman calls philosophy. The primary function of philosophy is to be able to see an image of the whole. This is exactly what Jen said, right? To unify all the disciplines, to put the disciplines together and to allow them to see their own shortcomings and the place they take among the whole. I won't say more because Jen said it better than I could, and I want to emphasize the second feature. But philosophy, as Newman describes it, Newman describes this philosophy as a habit acquired by life within this concrete aggregation of humans and sciences jostling around in one place. It's less a specific discipline than it is a habit. It's a habit in the Aristotelian sense. It's not an opinion or a master method or even a particular science, but a stable disposition, a perfected judgment formed over time that attempts to adequate itself to reality. The habit of philosophy is best described in a short discourse in the second half of the Idea of the University called Christianity and Scientific Investigation, where Newman preached this at the university, where he tried to lay out some principles for how theologians and physical scientists ought to conduct themselves towards one another. And if we've already talked a little bit about the unitive power, this is where you see the analogical power of philosophy displayed. So Newman starts by contrasting his philosophy with the method of a strict science or system. Now, while the philosophy of the imperial intellect sets its own task as the comprehension of the universe, the completion of that task is beyond its capacity, since, he says, the great universe itself cannot be gauged and meted by even the greatest of human intellects. The proper function of this philosophy is not to aim at a complete catalog or interpretation of the subjects of knowledge, but of following out, as far as man can, what in its fullness is mysterious and unfathomable. Therefore, the primary duty of the imperial intellect is to learn how much can be known in each province of thought, and when we must be contented not to know. These are all quotes from Newman. To distinguish between real and apparent difficulties, where inquiry gathers into coils insoluble by reason, where it is absorbed in mysteries or runs into the abyss. All of this is learned, Newman says, not by rules reducible to writing, but by sagacity, wisdom, and forbearance, with the consequence that the imperial intellect's most noticeable characteristic is a quasi-moral patience with apparent difficulties and inconsistencies. Newman says the possessor of an imperial intellect, that is the philosopher, is characterized by 3 notes. This is Newman now. If he has one cardinal maxim in his philosophy, it is that truth cannot be contrary to truth. If he has a second, it's that truth often seems contrary to truth. And if a third, it's a practical conclusion that we must be patient with such appearances and not be hasty to pronounce them to be really of a more formidable character. Philosophy is supposed to be simultaneously bold and modest, attempting to inquire into the whole universe while also admitting that the universe in its fullness will remain beyond reach. Its defining feature is this patience and accommodation of mystery, and a resistance to systematization, or the pride that comes from desiring to have discovered the key or master method to the universe. I want to identify this as the analogical power of philosophy, and this is why. Newman elaborates this power by means of an analogy. Immediately upon describing the philosophy of the imperial intellect, he alludes to the knowledge of the supreme being in order to deduce an illustration. He says of God, he, though one, is a sort of world of worlds in himself, giving birth in our minds to an indefinite number of distinct truths. Any one of God's attributes, considered by itself, is the object of an inexhaustible science, but the attempt to reconcile any 2 or 3 of them together affords matter for an everlasting controversy. Yet, because we find it difficult to reconcile divine mercy with divine justice, on no account do we deny either of these truths. Newman then extends this conclusion from the Creator to creation. He makes it analogous. The case is the same in its degree with his creation, material and moral. This is Newman again. It is the highest wisdom to accept truth of whatever kind, wherever it's clearly ascertained to be such, though there may be difficulty in adjusting it or adjusting it with other known truth. End quote. So the study of God in his multiplicity and unity is taken to be paradigmatic for the study of creation in similar multiplicity and unity. The appearance of seeming contradictions shouldn't shock us into either fideism or skepticism. Even though divine mercy and justice butt heads, we don't deny God, nor, since the rival claims of theology and physics, if they're rival claims, they don't cause us to despair of a knowable world, since that presupposition precedes any of our inquiries. We learn to be patient with the tardy appearance of a perfectly unified vision of the world. And we must be patient with these irregularities, often because they're salutary. The best example of this is Newman's analysis of how St. Athanasius uses various images of the divine being to refute the Arian reduction of the Trinity, just to a mere single instance. Newman says, word, sun, image, ray, light, all of these images cluster around the divine. They're not intended to explain how the sacred mystery is possible. They're merely intended to show that the words using it are not self-contradictory. In other words, the shortcomings of one set of images are corrected by another. I can't see a better elaboration of how the rivalry and the circle of all the sciences in the university works than this, all of these images together. Father and the Son are like a ray, and the Son like an image, like a light, all of these images fitting together in a circle. One must be patient with these rival images, to try to dispose of them or just find a single image that works best, though all the rest can be disregarded, that's Arianism. These apparent contradictions can work in favor of knowledge. Newman says in a later letter, when he was preparing for the Grammar of Assent, he talks about how both mechanical science and theology deal with their fundamental ambiguities. He says, "By this method of antagonism, we steady our minds, not so as to be able to reach their object, but to point them in the right direction. As in an algebraical process, we might add and subtract in a series, approximating little by saying and unsaying to a positive result." I love that conclusion. By saying and unsaying to a positive result. I mean, this could have come out of Pseudo-Dionysius's mystical theology. And here's Newman trying to push analogy back into a world accustomed to British empiricism. And he ends up using this kind of mysticism. It fits with so many of his analogies where like the polygon is slowly inscribed into the circle in which we come to believe something that can't quite be proven. One analogous image balances another, both inside individual sciences and expansively in the whole circle. But the judgment about the propriety of these analogies is the work of philosophy. When are these analogies proper? When aren't they? How far do they go? To what extent is theology like constitutional law? To what extent is it not? You got to say and unsay it. So here then are our two features of Newman's philosophy of the imperial intellect. It contains a unitive power that brings all of the disciplines into a circle and allows each discipline to see itself in light of the whole. But its analogical power acknowledges that these fundamental unities, God is Trinity, God is source of being, the one complex fact of creation itself, these unities are both known and unknown. They may be apprehended, if not completely comprehended, in Newman's language. And what this means is that various aspects check each other in an analogical way. More often than not, this is what I want to say. It shouldn't surprise anyone that the chief intellectual sin within the university is bigotry. That is, desiring one's method to expand to all explanatory power. That's analogical to the chief theological sin of heresy, which Newman describes as an undue emphasis on a single divine truth to the detriment of all the rest. Now, and these two features, the unitive and the analogical, mirror or correct the two features of viewiness that I mentioned earlier, right? The first kind of viewiness was accumulation of unconnected opinions. That's corrected by accumulation of sciences in an ever-expanding circle coordinated by the center point. And the bigotry of the man of one idea is corrected by the patience and far-seeing power of the philosophical habit of mind. Now, with this image of what Newman's philosophy looks like, I did it. I have 3 minutes, so I can talk about a couple instances. I want to take a couple examples from Newman's own writings to show how he does this, how he tries to judge properly when the analogy fits, when it doesn't, and how to unify things. The first instance is Intellect, the Instrument of Religious Training. This was a sermon preached at the University Church Dublin in 1856. Newman describes the nature of the human mind after the fall. Where once everything had been unified, now intellectual and moral virtue are separated, and the various elements of the soul have set up warring kingdoms within the individual. The problem for man is that he looks out into the world and he sees various centers and establishments, institutions, as it were, founded on a single element of the soul to the detriment of the others. Newman is good on this. Throughout the world, there are a bunch of institutions that characterize just a single element of the soul, but nowhere can he look to see them all blended together. How can this error be corrected? Here's Newman's answer: by the founding of a Catholic university, in which all the elements of the soul find their proper place. Here's the unitive function, but Newman is perceptive to see that one can't only argue in print for this, or prove it, as it were. He needs an institution. I mean, he's doing nothing if not working from Plato's city-soul analogy, but he's replaced the city with the Catholic university. And as a capstone, Newman identifies two leading analogies or metaphors for this work. The end of St. Augustine's wandering and return to the church, because he preaches this sermon on the feast day of St. Monica. You want to see how it all fits together? Look at Augustine coming back to the church. And then the second image is the personified Lady Wisdom of Sirach, chapter 24, who has compassed the circuit of heaven, whom Newman analogizes in good patristic or high medieval fashion to Our Lady. She is the model of the university. Here is unity and analogy. 1 minute. Good. I really wanted to, there's a third example that has to do with the law that I won't be able to get to, but I really want to talk about the mission of St. Benedict, in which Newman tries to adjudicate analogy because he's confronted with an improper analogy from 19th century philosophies of history. So the Mission of St. Benedict was written for Newman's college journal, The Atlantis, published in 1858. And you see Newman at work amid the very rivalry of sciences. He proposes to study the history of Christian education and finds three masters, Benedict, Dominic, and Ignatius. He even assigns them a badge. Benedict is the master of poetry, Dominic of science, Ignatius, prudence. And in laying out this schema, Newman acknowledges that he sounds very much like a somewhat popular notion of the day in which the life of mankind is separated into three stages. You get this from Auguste Comte, Comtean positivism, this vision of man as separated into the theological stage, the metaphysical stage, and maybe it's the positive stage or the historical stage after that. The three ages of man, with each previous age decisively overcoming and refuting the past. Now, whereas for a positivist or a philosophical historian, the past is decisively left behind as you get to the next age, Newman disputed this account. He says, undoubtedly a Catholic can have no sympathy with so heartless a view of life. Yet certainly there is a truth to it, a certain kind of truth. And Newman says, it is true that there are these three saints. There's a progress from poetry through science to prudence. But the important proviso that has to be borne in mind is that what the Catholic Church has once had, she's never lost. She's never wept over or been angry with time gone over. Instead of passing from one stage of life to another, she's carried her youth and middle age along with her onto the latest time. She hasn't changed possessions, but accumulated them and brought them out of her treasure house according to the occasion, things new and old. She didn't lose Benedict by finding Dominic, and she has both at home, though she became the mother of Ignatius. What's genius here is that first, the dominant image is Matthew 13. The kingdom of God is the treasure house, bringing out things new and old. This governs how we think about it. But the second is that Newman points out the only reason that there's any plausibility to this account of three ages is that it's similar to the life of a human being. But if we actually look at our own lives, isn't it more often the case that our lives are accumulative rather than exclusive? How often do we refute everything that happens when we turn 20 or 30 or 50? I guess, I'll leave the third aside. At a certain point, the limits of any science or inquiry are going to be at a certain point, there can never be a perfect calculus by which one sums up the limits of any individual science, and the philosophical habit of mind has to be attentive to how things are unified, but how those unities are always subject to revision. As he says, saying and unsaying to a positive effect. Thank you.
Well, last and least, I want to say how grateful I am to the many people here at the Columbus School of Law who helped to make this event possible, and most especially to my dear friend Mark DeGirolami for this invitation and the honor to participate in this conference on the occasion of his inauguration as the St. John Henry Newman Chair here at Catholic University. On May 5th, 1873, at the Jesuit Church in Mayfair, London, John Henry Newman preached the sermon at the funeral of his friend, the eminent barrister James Hope Scott, later collected in Newman's sermons preached on various occasions. One of the sadnesses of Newman's life was that he lived long enough to see many of his dear friends pass away before him, in addition, of course, to losing many friends when he was received into the Catholic Church. Captured, by the way, I think we've looked at this for a day and a half, by the way. I want to point out that famous painting of the portrait of Newman by Sir John Everett Millais, which I think is from 1880, I think captures maybe some of this sadness of Newman's life. In this lovely sermon, though, Newman spoke about Hope Scott's qualities of character as a lawyer and friend, as, for example, to Hope Scott's judgment with those who came to him for assistance, including about legal matters. Newman says that when they had to consult him and had experience of the simplicity, seriousness, and he says, I can use no other word, the sweetness of his manner, he threw himself at once into their ideas and feelings, listened patiently to them, and spoke out the clear judgment which he formed of the matters which they had put before him. Setting aside, by the way, the fact that Hope Scott had given arguably some poor advice to Newman related to the libel case, but this was an occasion for eulogy. Or to Hope Scott's lack of ambition. he says, but strange as it may appear at first sight, his indifference to the prizes of life was as marked as his qualifications for carrying them off. He was singularly void of ambition. And Newman couldn't help but include some observations about the perils of entering public life, which Hope Scott did throughout his career, including a very close association with Gladstone up to the time of Hope Scott's conversion to Catholicism, at which time he and Gladstone had an irretrievable break in their friendship. Never do men come together in considerable numbers, Newman said, but the passion, self-will, pride, and unbelief, which may be more or less dormant in them one by one, burst into a flame and becomes a constituent of their union. What is to be said about John Henry Newman and the law? Well, until the last day and a half, one might have thought not much. While Newman did, as Matthew Walter pointed out at lunch, consider becoming a lawyer for a career and was enrolled at Lincoln's Inn in preparation for a legal career, he was, of course, by vocation a cleric in the Church of England and then the Catholic Church. In his biography of Newman, though, Ian Carr writes that after Newman's death, his brother Francis maintained that Newman had learned his skills as a controversialist from Cicero, and that he could have been an eminent barrister. As a writer, he always had to have a thesis to attack or defend. But Newman often eschewed interest in politics and law, and his most important works are on matters of faith and reason, education, the history of Christian doctrine, not on social or political life. As Newman wrote late in his life, I feel myself to be so little of a judge on political and even social questions that I rarely feel it a duty to form and to express an opinion on any subject of a public nature. Whereas Colin Barr and Simon Skinner write in their entry on social and political thought in the Oxford Handbook, once the possibility of an organically Christian English state was closed to him by his conversion to Catholicism, practical politics could at best occupy only a secondary place among his concerns. It is true that Newman never wrote a major work in political theory as such, but he had a keen interest in contemporary politics by all accounts, and aspects of his thought do remain unexplored for legal and political thought. I think this conference has begun to remedy some of the defect. We've talked, for instance, about an essay on the development of doctrine and the account of tradition there, or the discussion of how one comes to know and understand a proposition in a grammar of assent has as yet largely unexplored bearing, perhaps on practical reasoning and law. What Sheridan Gilly writes of Newman's reaction against rationalism in religion might be applied to legal argument as well. As Gilly writes, in Newman's counter-revolution against the rationalist theory of knowledge, religious truth is discovered and transmitted not merely in reason, but in ways of which mankind is sometimes hardly conscious, in custom-conscious authority and tradition, through the heart, the affection, the will, and by the power of love from heart to heart. In these remarks about Newman and law, and legal education, perhaps in some sense, I want to take Newman's friendship with a lawyer, James Hope Scott, and a legal case that actually precipitated James Hope Scott's conversion to Catholicism in 1850. Because as the law students here know, a traditional way of learning about the law is the case method. So let's discuss a case. Newman and Hope Scott became friends in 1838, as I mentioned, and Hope Scott remained his friend until Hope Scott's death. But to understand Hope Scott's conversion, we must turn to a legal case in 1850 that precipitated not only the conversion of James Hope Scott, but also, by all accounts, Henry Edward Manning, later the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, to the Catholic Church. When asked to deliver a set of Lenten lectures at the London Oratory in 1850, 5 years after his reception in the Catholic Church, Newman took the occasion to diagnose the possible shortcomings and perils of an established national church, and took the occasion to take up the then recent judgment of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the then famous, but now almost entirely forgotten, Gorham case. The case involved an Anglican cleric, George Cornelius Gorham. In June 1847, he was offered the living or vicarage at Bramford Speke by the Lord Chancellor, because the power, or advocin, as it was called in the Church of England, for that parish church was directly under the control of the Crown and not under the control of the local Bishop of Exeter. Thus ensued a dispute that would roil the Church of England and lead Newman, as so often, to put pen to paper. At issue were Gorham's Calvinist sympathies, and in particular his views about baptismal regeneration. Gorham wrote in his pleadings in the case, "Our church, the Church of England, holds and I hold that no spiritual grace is conveyed in baptism except to worthy recipients, and as infants are by nature unworthy recipients, being born in sin and the children of wrath, they cannot receive any benefit from baptism except there shall have been a prevenient act of grace to make them worthy. The Bishop of Exeter at the time, Henry Philpotts, objected to the Lord Chancellor's effort to install Gorham into the vicarage and refused to institute him. The bishop did, that is. And so in the summer of 1848, Gorham filed suit against the Bishop of Exeter in the Court of Arches. Writing in the Ecclesiastical Law Journal in 1998, Andrew Jordan says that the dean's expressed concern, this is a quote, was to decide the case purely as a legal issue and to decline any attempt to be drawn into matters of theology, to consider the doctrine as set out in the text and decide whether Gorham's views were consistent with those texts. This was exactly, he says, the same approach adopted by the Privy Council on appeal. It is not insignificant. Critics allege that the civil authority was deciding matters of doctrine. It was not, he says. The case revolved on the construction of the governing text and was a linguistic exercise in order to determine whether Gorham's views were in fact consistent with the prayer book. So the question in the case, and posed by this recent interpretation of it, was could a court, a secular court, mind you, look only to the authoritative texts of the Church of England and determine whether Gorham's views were consistent with those texts without weighing in on any theological truths that exceeded the competence of such a court? I think for my part that this was and is perilous territory. Can one, earlier we had a whole discussion about text and tradition, can one interpret a text such as the prayer book of Common Prayer without any background understanding of the theological tradition from which those texts emerge and interpret them? The Court of Arches, as it happens, the judge there ruled against Gorham, holding based on the textual evidence alone, he said, that Gorham did indeed hold views about baptism that were at odds with the Church of England as expressed in the prayer book and otherwise. So Gorham appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which is the court of last appeal or appeal from ecclesiastical courts and others in England. Those of us who teach torts might recall, for instance, that the Wagon Mound case from Australia was decided by a Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, because Australia up until 1968 had such appeals. The panel, as it happened in the Judicial Committee, included the two archbishops of the Church of England, Archbishops of Canterbury and York, as well as the Bishop of London and several senior judges, but it was putatively a secular court. And as summarized by Jordan, the committee of the Privy Council concluded that there were points of doctrine related to baptism that were capable of being honestly understood in different senses, and upon those points all ministers of the Church, having duly made the subscriptions by law and taking Holy Scripture for their guide, are at liberty honestly to exercise their private judgment without offense or censure. Gorham's views, applying such a test, were not, the Privy Council held, contrary or repugnant to the declared doctrine of the Church of England, and that Gorham ought not therefore be refused admission to the living at Bramford Speak. The Bishop of Exeter, as it happened, still objected and filed parallel claims in various tribunals, all being rejected. And finally, on August 6, 1850, Gorham was instituted over the bishop's objection by Sir Herbert Jenner Faust, Dean of the Arches. As an aside, by the way, one hears echoes of some contemporary American church-state controversies about civil court jurisdiction over internal church governance, including doctrinal disputes and the employment decisions regarding ministers who perform significant religious functions within such institutions. Newman, for his part, as I mentioned, took the occasion for these Lenten lectures at the oratory to weigh in the first volume of certain difficulties felt by Anglicans in Catholic teaching and a chapter on the relationship of the established church to the nation. Granted, in a somewhat polemical tone about what he saw as the dangers of this course of action, Newman discussed the problems of religious doctrine being collapsed into politics. As he wrote in that chapter, as the nation changes its political, so may it change its religious views. The causes which carry the Reform Bill and free trade may make short work with orthodoxy. The great legal authorities, he said, on whose report it was made, the Gorham case that is, have not only pronounced it as a matter of fact, persons who have denied the grace of baptism have held the highest preferment in the national church, but they felt themselves authorized actually to interpret its ritual and its doctrine and to report to Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, that the dogma of baptismal regeneration is not part and parcel of the natural religion. They felt themselves strong enough in their position to pronounce that the doctrine held by the Protestant clergyman, Gorham, who brought the matter before them was not contrary or repugnant to the declared doctrine of the Church of England as by law established. As Newman concluded, the same popular voice which has explained away the wording of the office for baptism may, of course, in a moment dispense with the Athanasian Creed altogether. May not the freeborn, self-dependent, animal-minded Englishman choose his religion for himself and have lawyers any more to do than to state as a matter of fact in history what that religion is and for centuries has been? How is it possible that the national church, forsooth, should be allowed to dogmatize on a point which so immediately affects the nation itself? I think that here in Newman's reflections on the Gorham case, which again precipitated Hope Scott's and Manning's conversion to Catholicism, I think he saw and diagnosed some of the problems of an established church here just 5 years after his own conversion and departure from the Church of England, and the dangers of this interpenetration of secular and ecclesial authority that marked the authorities in the Church of England, weighing in here on theological doctrine, if, in fact, as I think is the more persuasive view, courts are not competent to weigh on these issues purely as a textual matter, but must inevitably weigh in on theological doctrines. And even in a court that included bishops among its members, nonetheless, as a secular court, it exceeded this jurisdiction, and Newman presciently, in many ways, diagnosed the perils and dangers of this route. Well, as Russell Kirk observed in his chapter on Disraeli and Newman in The Conservative Mind, Newman, who did much to save the church from being a mere tool of political authority, looked upon the life of the Spirit as ascent to truth and upon education as the ladder to this transcendent wisdom. But, Kirk concluded, Disraeli and Newman knew that the phrase law and order is not tautological. Law, sacred or mundane, depends upon order, hierarchy, spirit idea, and gradation of society. So to conclude where we began, what is the relationship of Newman's thought to the law? This conference has given us many answers and things to think about tradition and development. In these remarks, I came down, as it were, from those heights of theological speculation to the everyday reality of a friendship between a churchman and a barrister, a funeral sermon, and an everyday litigation on which Newman, as he did so often, weighed in on the topics of the day in ways that are relevant to questions about tradition and the law. Thank you. So we have about 16 minutes or so, is that right, for questions?
Thank you all for your remarks. Dr. Walker, you made the point that the university is supposed to be a bulwark against the viewiness of the day. I was wondering if you could comment on how that's really possible in the age of the internet. You think about how these places develop really naturally. Like if you're a medieval man, there's very few sources of information. So you're going to these cities like Paris or Oxford because knowledge has to be patiently acquired. There's not many books. You have to hear from the learned men, wherever they may be. And so there's the necessity of other people in where you're learning. And I mean, this happens in America too. You have the Chicago School, Yale School. And I'll briefly add that, like, I'm a 1L. And I think often about how law was always this apprenticeship model. That's how you learned the field. But it's very easy to slip into rationalistic modes of thinking when I have like the restatements before me. And I can just like easily mine like all of these things that seem to come to me almost ahistorically. And I think that the internet in many ways incarnates a lot of the epistemologies that Newman is pushing back against. You could also just read this as a question to bash secular technological liberalism, if you'd like. But yeah, I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Newman says in the preface to the Rise and Progress of Universities, this other set of university discourses he makes, he says, there are two modes of instruction. There's the mode of instruction according to the written word, but there's also the mode of instruction according to oral tradition. And there's something simply different about oral tradition than reading the written word itself. And he has this, I guess, economically silly statement he makes, but he's not an economist and he doesn't need to be. He says, you need first to find, in economics, you need to identify demand and then fill the supply. But he says for education, what you do is you sit down and you create the supply, and the supply itself will create demand. And I think that's what, I mean, right, like the guys who followed Socrates around didn't know they needed him until they saw him. And I think to answer your question, I don't know, you have to have the physical presence of a university that makes itself look dramatically different from online culture. This may be strange or odd or unusual, but is attractive in being strange or odd or unusual. It's the best I can do.
Well, thank you very much for all the presentations. Michael, I have a question for you, and I know it's one that you've thought about a little bit before and maybe in some other writing, but in particular with respect to the story that you tell, I wonder if you would reflect on some of the distinctions between a theological and political liberalism. Exactly in light of this kind of story, we've heard about the importance of conscience. Jenny Martin mentioned that in Newman's thinking. How you sort of see see a story like the one that you're talking about, which is really about a kind of an understanding of separation as informing the theological liberalism versus political liberalism debate about what Newman was about and what the sort of kinds of political theological questions that he was grappling with.
Well, and I guess question made this clear. I think his worry in that chapter about the Gorham case was that as a guardian against guard against theological liberalism, an established church that was so knitted into he wouldn't have said the Democrat, but basically the kind of the mores of the people and of the state and its own authority exercised in cases like that one. That it won't be able to hold on to doctrinal orthodoxy, right? And that so that the combat against liberalism depends in some way on a constitutional separation between church and state that the English state at the time did not acknowledge and could not acknowledge under its own terms. If that makes sense. Yeah.
I was struck in Professor Levering's remarks by what he noted about Brian McCall dedicating that book to Archbishop Lefebvre, and it elicited sort of whispers of horror or groans or whatever. But I wonder, the kind of major Anglophone school of Newman studies presents him as a kind of proto-Nouvelle guy, a tame, though of course very interesting, kind of post-Vatican II conservative. But I wonder, should we treat Newman as such a kind of innocuous figure since we're bringing him in dialogue with all kinds of other stuff? I wonder, what about Newman and Lefebvre?
Yeah, Newman and Lefebvre. I don't know.
I'm serious, because he wasn't an innocuous figure to his ecclesiastical superiors in his own time, even the ones who liked him.
Right. So I agree with you. I do agree that Newman was no innocuous figure. So he was very close to Dollinger. I don't know how you pronounce that in German, Ignaz von Dollinger. And so the whole issues surrounding the capacity of the historian to adjudicate dogma, and then also to sort of recognize when the Pope had exceeded the bounds. Remember, this was Dollinger's basic idea, is that Dollinger thought that he could recognize on the basis of just simple historical research, which he was incredibly profound. He was a profound thinker, Dollinger thought he could recognize when the Pope, this is particularly with regard to papal infallibility, had exceeded any possible bounds, because in Dollinger's historical research indicated that there was nothing at all like, there's simply nothing like the dogma of papal infallibility, what the dogma claimed, there was nothing like it in the first 800 years. It just was impossible. And so Dollinger thought that he could, on the basis of basic knowledge of tradition, which he did not need the magisterium to inform him what the content of tradition was, because he had that research, he had that basic knowledge. And so now Newman was close to Dollinger, and was sympathetic. He really was, but Newman didn't go that path. And so, as I see it, Archbishop Lefebvre basically went a path similar to Dollinger. Now, I'd have to explain that a lot more, but I think that's essentially what he did. Is and Dollinger was extremely disappointed with Newman, because Dollinger thought that Newman really was a radical, like he was, and just wasn't going to put up with these crazy Italian, uneducated popes and theologians, and the Jesuits sort of, feeding this. And so there was a tremendous amount of anti-Jesuit stuff in Germany at the time. But so Dollinger was so disappointed with Newman, because he thought that Newman really was that kind of radical. And of course Lord Acton was Dollinger's student and extremely close to him. And Acton was also completely horrified. But so my basic point, though, is that in certain ways we should think of Newman as radical. He certainly was. But he doesn't go the last step, and so, in other words, he finds a way to accept the teaching of Vatican I. He finds a way to accept that teaching as true, and he gives an argument for it. Now, the argument did not persuade Dollinger at all, let alone Acton. But he did find a way, and so Newman then, and the reason, essentially Newman accuses Dollinger, this is a key part of the response to Gladstone. So, in this, the letter to Gladstone is really aimed at Dollinger, who's kind of the ghostwriter behind Gladstone, feeding Gladstone a lot of this information that Gladstone uses to attack Newman. And so, and I'm telling you stuff that you know, but anyway, so Newman responds and just says, look, there's a limit, and he essentially accuses Dollinger of private judgment, but he basically says there's kind of a limit that historians can know. You can sort of have some kind of knowledge of tradition, and you can make an account, but you can't. In the end, it's going to be the bishops, and it's going to exceed what the historians' capacities, because there is, the presence of the Spirit and faith and so on. I think I've rambled. I apologize for that.
Thank you all for those really terrific presentations. I have a question for Matthew, and that is whether I have grasped one of your theses correctly, and that is that maybe you're suggesting the answer to a question posed by the conference is to understand Newman as protecting an origin of dogmatic truth through internally consistent traditional application in New Ages. And then moving to the law, it seemed that your first move was to understand law analogically as essentially comparatively to revelation in Scripture, to revelation in eternal law proportioned to reason. And then if we start with law as eternal law and participated by man through natural law, then a coherent tradition will specify that natural law differently from age to age, but never jettisoning the origin of its legitimacy in eternal and natural law.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it, because no one is claiming. For example, when you think of Newman in terms of development of doctrine, he's not claiming that every papal teaching, or every synod or council, or even a small councils, or everything that's been said by these every early church thing. He's not claiming that everything is true. He's what he's honing in on is just that that the church has never betrayed this core revelation that's been handed in terms of solemn teaching, never betrayed by solemn teaching. And so you could think of it, similar to if there were a tradition of law that, despite all the varieties of positive law, had never in some sort of solemn way, if there were such a tradition of law that had never betrayed the natural law. Now Newman, I don't think would think that is the case, and neither does McCall. But what he does think, though, is that there is a possibility McCall thinks there's a possibility, to think of law that way, that there is a knowledge of the natural law present in all cultures and all ages, including our own. And so there's at least the seed of natural law that that has been present through the ages and continues to be the real ground of positive law. Now, but I think they would both agree that there is no one consistent tradition where that has held up.
Which is the whole point of positive law, specifying according to contingencies
That's true, but now sometimes, though, of course, you'll have the positive law that has really corrupted or acted against. That's the only difference. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I want to address you just once more at the close of our gathering. First and foremost, to thank some important people who have made this event the great success that it is. First, to Carol McHale and Josh Gang, whose tireless work and enormous efforts on countless fronts have really borne fruit in the splendid conference. Second, to Rui Barros, our excellent videographer, always impeccable in his quality. Third, to Joe Ferraro, who has been greatly helpful with the program and in promoting the event. Fourth, Greg Stack with his assistance with our technology here at the law school. Fifth, to the caterers from Zest for the care with which they provided our food. Sixth, to the student workers of the center, Nikki Zakaria, Brett Zakari, Andrea Quinan, and Thomas Showalter. They have manned the ramparts and assisted us at every turn. Seventh, to our speakers and my friends, all guests here, for the really rich reflections and the friendship to me, to our center, that you have displayed. It's been a wonderful experience for me to have this conference with you on a personal and professional level. And finally, to Lewis Brown, to Bill Rooney, and of course to my partner and co-conspirator, the great Elizabeth Kirk, whose keen mind keeps me well-ordered, well-directed, and with whose friendship I'm truly greatly blessed. Rather than attempt to do justice to the rich themes and arguments that have emerged over the course of the last few days, may I suggest in closing that I think it is the high office, it's the great privilege of a Catholic university, of its special mission, to rekindle the humanistic spirit of learning that is, I'm afraid, now greatly diminished in higher education. It's the business of a Catholic university in these days to strive to unite virtue and knowledge and to explore the interconnections and their codependencies, to build playgrounds for the mind and the soul. And it will certainly be our mission to strive to achieve that unity, for, as Cardinal Newman has put it, all knowledge forms one whole because its subject matter is one. For the universe in its length and breadth is so intimately knit together that we cannot separate off portion from portion and operation from operation. We will do this at our third annual Spring Symposium in this spring, 2025, whose subject is Knowledge and Institutions, and which will feature Professor James Hankins, Yuval Levin, and Justice Caleb Stiegel, and to which you are all most welcome now that you know the way. Let's close with one final prayer by Cardinal Newman, in the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. May the Lord support us all the day long, till the shades lengthen and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then in his mercy may he give us a safe lodging and holy rest and peace at the last. Amen.